Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to once again be joined by Stephen Price. Ever since his first score for a feature film in 2011, a film called Attack the Block, Stephen Price has become one of the industry's best and most versatile composers, scoring films such as The World's End, Gravity, Fury, Suicide Squad, Baby Driver, Wonder Park, The Aeronauts, Disneynature's Dolphin Reef, and many more. On top of that, Stephen scored great documentaries such as The Hunt and Our Planet. On this episode, we will focus on his most recent projects such as Archive, David Attenborough, Alive on Our Planet, and Over the Moon. It is my pleasure to welcome Stephen Price.
Hello again. Nice to be back.
It's great to have you on my show again. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to chat again. I really appreciate that.
That's my pleasure.
And at first, Stephen, I would like to talk a little bit about Archive. This marks the directorial debut of Gavin Rothery, who also wrote the screenplay. And the film is set in the future, the year 2038, and it deals with a scientist trying to advance artificial intelligence, all while also bringing back his wife from the dead. I would love to discuss your approach of scoring a science fiction movie and finding the musical tone for a machine and the person's obsession to bring back a loved one.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of those projects that just seemed to arrive at the right time. I'd been starting to feel like I wanted to do a bit of an electronic score. I hadn't really done an electronic thing since the days of Gravity, and I was doing a lot of more orchestral and sort of slightly epic-y kind of things. And so I had this thought in the back of my mind that I fancied doing some experiments with some synths and electronic things. And this script arrived from Gavin, and I'd not met Gavin before, and we had a mutual friend who passed the script on to me. And it was just really clear that this was a film that you could really get stuck into some concepts, you know. And I met Gav very early on before he'd shot the film, and we talked about the arc of the film, really, which is this the lead in the film. He's basically trying to create artificial intelligence robots. So he's trying to make them as lifelike as possible. And he's going through various iterations. So he starts off with J1 robot, who's learning, kind of ended at the age of 6 or 7. And then J2 was his next attempt, which kind of ended as a teenager, a sort of 14, 15-year-old teenager, before heading on to J3. And his ultimate aim is to find a home for the consciousness of his wife, who we see earlier in the film as past, and her consciousness is kept in the thing called the archive. So immediately we had these ideas of you could really play with electronic and organic music, because he's trying to make an organic kind of thing, something to replace an organic thing out of electronics. And the idea that you could start off with a very electronic score, and gradually as the film developed, you could kind of start bringing in more organic features. And, you know, that would not only be in terms of the music, the instruments used, but also the way I was writing. You know, it starts off as very blunt, short statements for the first robot. And then gradually as he goes through his iterations and he studies more, and we see this web coming together, the music itself would kind of develop outwards as well. So it was really fun to work on. And, yeah, it was the sort of project, looking back on it, I should have done in 2020, because it was basically me just sitting in my studio at home surrounded by flashing boxes, which is kind of what 2020 has become, you know. But I did it around about this time last year. And yeah, it was a lot of fun to work with Gavin. We ended up doing a bit of cello recording at Abbey Road to finish it off, but it's largely an electronic score.
As I mentioned before, this was his very first movie as a director. And how did you experience this collaboration? I mean, obviously directors also during post-production, they have millions of little things and details to worry about. Sometimes, of course, a first-time director also needs to, let's say, overcome the jitters of directing their very first project. How did you collaborate with him?
Well, the great thing about Gavin is how trusting he was for that, because I mean, he'd been working on this project for best part of 10 years. He was very involved in the making of the film Moon, alongside Duncan Jones, and he'd done all the design for that film and been very involved in the visual look of it. And I think you can see in Archive that his aesthetics very clear there, that it comes across in a similar sort of way. But he was so on top of everything. He'd written the script, he directed it, he was looking after all the actors. But then in post production, he was very, very involved in visual effects because that's his background. So he was doing an awful lot of that stuff, which is how he's managed to take a very small budget film and make it look like something that's way more expensive just through his own hard work and skill. So he was doing all of that, and with the music, he was very good at talking to me about the concepts that he was trying to put across. But when it came to the music itself, he just kind of wanted to hear things so he could comment on them. He didn't want to sort of lead me or tell me what he particularly wanted, because I don't think he knew until he'd heard it, and neither did I really. So it was just a matter of me sort of starting to give him stuff. And the problem I found with this film is that I had to get to the end of it before I knew what I was going to do at the beginning of it. So the first time I played him any music at all, I played him the entire film, which is one of those, if he hadn't have liked it, it would have been game over, really. But luckily there was enough in there that he did like that we could kind of start getting stuck into it together and tweaking what needed to be tweaked. But yeah, it was a fun one. It was a lot of energy, and he really played music well. There were scenes in the film where there's no dialogue, and music really is just carrying a lot of the big emotional moments in the film. So that's always a nice thing to do.
And of course, it also leaves room for sound exploration and also experimentation. It's kind of technology meets humanity, if you will. You used synth elements, also vocoders in there, and also a fretless e-bowed guitar, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I have this habit of picking up instruments, and then I just get them and I learn to play them a bit, and then they just wait for their film, or their project. And I'd had this thing for a while, and it's basically it's a fretless guitar, but the fretboard itself is made of metal, which means the notes can extend. They can sustain for much longer than a normal fretless thing. And I found this way of playing it where I also use an e-bow on it, so I'm not really plucking the strings. I'm kind of playing it with it's like a sort of a system of magnets, really, an e-bow, just to sort of vibrate the string. And so you could have these endless notes that kind of, if you got it right, you could kind of make it talk, and you could make it sound almost sung. And that became the voice of these early iterations of the robots that George, the lead character, is making. Kind of these almost sort of electronic, but with enough movement in them to sound kind of human as well. And gradually that sound evolved into the sound of a cello for the later iterations of his work. So yeah, it found its film, that sound. It was good to find the usage for it.
Right, thank you very much for elaborating on that, Stephen. And how would you actually describe artificial intelligence and the music of the future? I mean, also vis-a-vis your own personal approach of the sci-fi genre.
I think this one, if anything, was I mean, my previous work in sci-fi was things like Gravity, where we really were trying to find sounds that had never been made before in a film, and it was all about if anything felt at all like it had been used before, I was immediately not allowed to use it. It was really sort of a reach. Whereas with this one, I kind of wanted to embrace some of those more classic kind of synth sounds, and there's a lot of Moog stuff in there and a lot of Oberheim kind of things, those sort of synths. And in terms of the artificial intelligence of it, I felt like it needed to have a lot of algorithmic sort of qualities to it. So there's an awful lot of rotating patterns and weaving kind of elements that overlap each other, and almost like code kind of overlapping and starting to morph into new things. So I was playing with a lot of arpeggiators and things like that, which tended to kick up other little ideas. You'd have these patterns working against each other, and they would suggest a harmony, or they'd suggest a little bit of a melody thing. So it was fun to sort of work with the electronic stuff in the writing. It's like we were collaborating with the machines a little bit.
Now I would like to talk about David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planets, a new autobiographical documentary which was directed by Alistair Fothergill, Jonathan Hughes, and Keith Sholay. It is David Attenborough's witness statement, if you will, in which he shares his concern for the current state of the planet caused by human impact on nature. And the film was released on Netflix actually on October 4th. Stephen, what are your thoughts on David Attenborough, his legacy, and the opportunity this film offered you personally?
Well, obviously, I mean, Sir David is just, he's an absolute legend in certainly in my country, and there's not a memory I have of him not being around. He's from when I was very little. He's always been teaching us things on TV and showing us amazing, wondrous things, and then latterly starting to share his concerns with how the world's kind of in a terrible state now. And this particular film felt like on one side, it followed on from the work we'd done together on the show called Our Planet for Netflix, which was much more of a traditional natural history show in that it showed you the wonders of the world, and it showed you the beautiful things, and it showed you the characters and all these amazing sights. But it did start to introduce the concept that these things aren't going to last, and we are ruining this. And the thing about the film that followed, Our Life on Our Planet, this was Sir David really doubling down on that in a way he never has done before. This is him sitting down in front of the camera, directly talking about his life. He's seen so much of the natural world. He when he started making his programs, commercial flights were just happening. So he was one of the first people to go see these incredible things. And in the 60, 70 years he's been doing this, he's seen it go from wilderness to a place that humans have overrun, basically. And he's never really talked about it. It's become, there's little hints of it in Planet Earth. They might talk about plastics in the ocean, or, in Our Planet, we might talk about melting of glaciers, but he'd never really talked about what he'd seen and his feelings when he'd realized what was happening. And that's what this film is. And it's a much more intimate film than anything I'd done with him before. The shows I'd done before had been sort of big orchestral scores and quite sweeping and big forces. Whereas this one, it felt it needed to be the scale of David himself talking to you directly. And I was really concerned that it was the sort of music he would want, and so I asked around a little bit, what sort of things does David listen to? And the director, Johnny Hughes, who'd worked very closely with David on a couple of things, was, he's just only chamber music. His record collection is full of chamber music. So we made the decision that this would be a chamber piece, and it's a small string ensemble and various soloists. There's piano solos and violin, cello, flute, clarinet, and horn and trumpet solos at various points of the film. But it was all made to feel very kind of intimate and to really just let David's message come across as much as possible and support it every step of the way.
And I was going to say, Stephen, it doesn't have a large orchestration per se, but yet it feels very lavish due to the message which you brought across musically. So with the string ensemble and the solo instruments, and there are quite a few cues in there which I liked in particular. For instance, saving ourselves and nothing to stop us, or we must rewild the world. The whole of humanity, which featured some lovely violin parts, which also expresses hope. Yet it feels very sad, but also reflective.
Well, the film was so beautifully structured. It really did go through David's life. So we started the film, with a lot of enthusiasm, and it's his excitement of the adventure. This man going around all over the world, not knowing what he might see and being able to share it with people. And then gradually, the film kind of shows him realizing how it's breaking. So you'd go from these themes that were quite buoyant and quite sort of excited to starting to collapse them, and it was fun to go. It was quite harrowing to write. I wrote it in sequence so I could kind of feel the journey as it went. So I wrote it in the order that you see it in the film, and we recorded it in that order as well. So the musicians felt the same thing, by halfway through the sessions when we were in the middle of the film and we were dealing with the stuff that's really, as dark as it gets, really, and the stuff that shows what might happen if we don't start to act, what might be the future for the planet. It was kind of heavy in the studio, it felt very low down. But then we do get to pick it up at the end, and David has very clear thoughts in the film about things that could help the planet, and his hope that it can be done, and his belief that young people will do it, and so it does end very optimistically, which meant I could make things a little more expansive there. And luckily he came to the sessions during the uplifting things, so it was nice to have him there for that. So when he was doing his inspiring message, he got to inspire the orchestra a bit as well, and he spoke to them before we recorded that track. We need to rewild the world. We must rewild the world. He actually gave a little speech to the musicians just before they recorded that, so that's a lovely memory to have.
It's a very important and also touching subject. Please describe how you reflected the core of the story musically?
It's a balance for me. It's kind of what I always want to be with this issue is I want people to be moved by it, because at the end of the day, I think if people are moved by it, they're more likely to act. And so, but the emotion can never feel forced, you know. So for me, I just am completely honest to how I feel when I watch it. You know, when I see Sir David sitting, looking for the first time in my lifetime, he does look, you know, like a man of his years, and he's looking very, very upset by what he's seen and the state of the planet. You know, looking back at his life, and now he's doing this thing and trying to support the planet. It just makes you feel very, very sad. So I'm just honest to that, and you know, I just follow completely the tone of his voice, and I follow his eyes, and hopefully that means that we make something which feels kind of emotionally true. And because David is so brilliant at what he does, you know, if I stick with him emotionally, I think we give a good sense to people. He's such a wonderful communicator that, you know, I just hang on his every word basically, and that seems to get us into the right sort of places.
We are talking about his story and his legacy, and of course the story couldn't be more current. You know, we are talking about the preservation of life. It's a
Yeah.
very personal journey, and I can imagine it must have been difficult also for you to create something which is sustainable in music wise.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, it is a bit, but in a sense, it's kind of it's the sort of process of writing it is quite rewarding for that, because you're so desperate to not let him down, you know, and the message is so important. And all any of us care about who made the film is that it gets watched, you know. So every scene was discussed in great detail with the directors, and they were fantastic with me in terms of making sure I stayed on the path, you know. And if it felt like I was going too dark, that I was actually going to put people off, they would help me sort of rectify that. And between us, just all of us desperately wanting this thing to be as good as it could be, we kind of just kept tweaking it into place. And Johnny Hughes is fantastic with music, and he's very good at picking out the piece of music that's going to help you in the rest of the film. And I wrote The Whole of Humanity, which is a scene in the film very early on where Sir David talks about the moon landings and the first time we saw the Earth from space, and we saw this, you know, blue marble hanging there, and how all of humanity was there. And I wrote a piece of music for that quite early on, and I thought it had something, but you never know until someone else has heard it. And Johnny heard that one and basically started suggesting other places where it might live. And with that bit of structure there, it kind of really helped me find my way through the rest of the film. You know, it meant we always had these little melodies that we'd come back to, and that would help little moments of storytelling when Sir David started talking about elements of his life. So yeah, between us, we all supported each other through it, really.
In the film, Sir David also says nature is our biggest ally and inspiration. A very true statement, which I can imagine also helped you or guided you through the project.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, everything needed to feel like it belonged, you know, and everything needed to feel, and again, beautifully way that they edited the film to really bring that relationship between nature and us out. You know, it never dwelled too long on anything. It always showed the interrelations of everything. So my music needed to interrelate, and it needed to feel like a one constant story that was growing. And sometimes it goes out of harmony for a while, you know, because the earth has done, but then it would always pull together. And yeah, I think the writing of the last third of the film, when he's talking about these ideas of living with nature rather than trying to control nature, they were lovely to write, because you could kind of really try and make all these patterns that you set up throughout the rest of the film really feel like they lock together, and really feel like these kind of disparate melodies that you might have introduced early on in the film slotted together in a way that felt like they were meaning something. So yeah, the natural history generally has been wonderful for me to write to. I really kind of enjoy working to those images, but this one, just because of the heightened sense of importance of the project, it was kind of daunting at the start, but really satisfying as you got into it.
The images were fantastic. It featured some very great cinematography again, stunning images actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's what I thought was most admirable about the images in this one is that they didn't shy away from showing the damage as well. You know, often in the more commonly shown in natural history shows. It's all glorious. It's all glorious. Whereas some of the most affecting things, I think, in this latest film are the shots that aren't the most beautiful, but their placement makes them beautiful. There's one shot of an orangutan who, there's one remaining tree in its home, and it climbs that tree and looks around, and it's the most sort of saddest sight you'll ever see, basically. But it just something about the way that they built these sequences together
Yes.
had a rhythm to them, which was just lovely to write to. It just felt like the whole thing flowed very nicely.
These images needed to be incorporated because also the film needs to serve as a wake-up call, if you will.
That's definitely the hope, and it's a difficult time for a film like that, because obviously this is a very difficult year for lots of people, but this particular issue is one that's it's the next one down the line, and so we just, I think everyone involved in the project is just desperately keen that it gets seen, because I think people who do see it seem to be very moved by it and hopefully inspired to help the cause and make changes, and encourage their politicians ultimately to make changes, which is what we really need. Overall, hopefully it gets seen and his message gets across, because I think he's the greatest communicator of these ideas that we've ever had.
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And Stephen, a couple of minutes ago, you said you asked people as to which kind of music or what kind of music Sir David likes to listen to. How would you describe him as a person in musical terms?
He is incredibly musical, is the sense I always get. And the way I always think of it is the very first show I did with him was The Hunt, back in 2015. And I hadn't worked to his, it's the only episode on that series that I didn't work to his narration. I worked away from it. They hadn't had time to record it. And then I wrote and recorded the music. And then I heard the dub, and he had performed to the music, and he has a beautiful way of communicating, which is very, very musical. And I think that's why his voice is so listened to and trusted. And obviously the content of his words is incredible, and it's always beautifully delivered and direct, but poetic. But there's a way he delivers things musically, which means I think his message is universal, and when you meet him, he's very undemonstrative. He came to the sessions and I didn't even realize he was there for the first few minutes, because he didn't announce himself. He just sat there very quietly and he listened in. And we asked him to give a few words to the orchestra, because it's what a wonderful thing for them. But he's not someone who draws attention to himself, but he's a very thoughtful man. And when he does speak, it's because it's worth listening to. So I have nothing but admiration for him, really, in the way he's carried himself for 65 years plus now in the public eye, certainly in this country. And very, very sad in one way that he has to use these years of his life to really push a campaign like this, but equally very grateful that it's him that's doing it.
Your job on this film was not only to write music which is appropriate for the images on the screen, but you also needed to reflect his personality.
Yeah, and I think that very much influenced every decision that was made. And it was, I never wanted to do something just for the sake of it. And this, there's a tendency in films when you see something beautiful to go for it. But if his words weren't saying that, we didn't. And this is a much more restrained score than anything I'd done on previous shows of his. And it meant I could be really precise in the writing for specific players as well. Because we kept the ensemble small, it was a really hand-picked group of players, and they're people that I've worked with on a lot of projects and just love how they play. And so as I was writing, I could kind of hear how Phil Cobb, for example, was going to play the trumpet. That's the sound that I love, and so I was writing specifically for him. And likewise with Will Schofield on the cello, who's done an awful lot of work with me in the past. I just loved the way he plays, and so as I was writing, I was kind of thinking, how to get the best out of all of these players and to let them really, deliver as they like to play as well. So there was something about the scale of this project that felt really correct. And the sessions that we did for it were some of the nicest that I've ever been part of. It was such a lovely atmosphere, and they just played great. I mean, I couldn't have been more proud of the thing when we left the studio that day. The players just really gave us some wonderful performances throughout the sessions.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Now I would like to talk about Over the Moon, a film directed by Glenn Keane and John Kars. Over the Moon has now been released on Netflix, a new animated musical adventure, so to speak. And could you please explain the scoring process of this film, scoring a colorful animated film from a grown-up's point of view, so to speak? What can you tell me about that?
Well, it was just a bit of a dream, really. I mean, I'd obviously grown up with Glenn's work. You know, Glenn was the lead animator on things like Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid and Tarzan and all these films from that amazing era of Disney films. So the idea of working with him and John on this one was just incredible. And when I came on board, the songs were written, so they existed as demos. So I knew that some of my job would be to weave between those and make that feel like a seamless journey. But really, there was an hour plus needed of score that really told this story, which is quite an emotional story about a young girl, Fei Fei, who loses her mum. And throughout the course of this film, in which she travels to the moon and she has these adventures, it's really all about her getting over that loss. And so this incredibly emotional story being told through the means of this Chinese legend of the moon goddess who lives up on the dark side of the moon, a place called Lunaria, which in Glenn's drawings, which he showed to me before I started working on the project, just looks like nothing you've ever seen before. This amazing kind of magical neon sort of wonderland, which you could juxtapose with this insanely beautiful China, this Chinese water village that the beginning and the end of the film is based in. So it was just this great opportunity to do so many different things. You had pure storytelling, you had working with the most incredible characterizations on screen, in terms of the heart that is shown through these drawings, through this animation. It's just remarkable. But equally, you had huge, great vistas that you'd never really seen before. So you could be quite bold with the way you wrote as well. So I got to do an awful lot of things on Over the Moon, and it was loads of fun working with Glenn. It was just a really great experience.
To me, the standout moment of the score was the cue Journey to Lunaria. To me, that was the musical core of the film, just for me personally. And I think it was the biggest moment of the film, also in terms of the actual writing process, because this scene offered so much.
And that was always the scene I was most worried about, but it was also the one I was kind of excited about, because the visuals there, when we see them flying into Lunaria, were the first things I was shown, and the thing that really convinced me that I really wanted to do this film. And it was kind of it was a funny process, because I wrote this little tune really early on after seeing those visuals, and then kind of put it away and didn't really start work on the film for quite a while after that. It just sort of sat on a hard drive as a tiny little piano and whistling kind of thing. I think guitar and whistling was the demo. But when I came to get to that scene, it was the one I knew I had to put. The first time I played them any music, that had to be part of it, because if that didn't work, then nothing either side of it would work either. But as soon as I put those chords and that little melody to it, it just seemed like it had this sense of wonder that Fei Fei's got when she's flying into this incredible, weird-looking kind of moon place that she goes to. And it had this, but then the collaboration with the animators was great from them, because I had this melody and I had this stretcher which was working, but every time I got a new picture, there'd be a little bit more lighting going on, or a little bit more animation in the background, and you'd see some of the movement of the Lunarians, and you'd see some of these little weird planets which are all born of the moon goddess's tears, so everything is pulsating and glowing and lit as if from within. And that would make me go back to the music, and it would make me change the way I was voicing it, and it would make me change the textures that I was using. And so after a few iterations of it and a little bit of back and forth, suddenly this piece started taking a bit of a life of its own, and it really dictated the sound of Lunaria and what we did from then. So yeah, it was it always felt like an important bit to write, and luckily when Glenn first heard it, he responded well, and then I think we knew at that point we were going to have fun working on the rest of the film together.
I would like to talk a bit about the process of writing music, which takes the audience from the Earth to the moon, basically. How did you try to establish a musical voice for the family, Fei and also the moon adventure itself?
It felt like you were dealing with two different scales of storytelling on this one, but knowing that your themes had to work through both. So, I started off working on the China material at the start of the film, and for that, it's a very family-based situation. It's a very busy place. All the rooms are small. Everything is full of energy. Fei's always rushing on to the next job. She's always keeping herself very busy, and she's certainly after her mum died. That busyness is stopping her really from dealing with the grief she's feeling. So there was always this sense that the world was too busy for her. And so every conversation she's interrupted, right? And everyone is talking over everyone else. And so musically, that kind of dictated what I was doing. And there were lots of rapid string lines. And Glenn was always looking for energy and looking that Fei would feel like this real sort of character. And when she meets the character Chin, who's the son of Mrs. Zhong, who her father is becoming close to, he as well, he's a very busy kind of character, and he's full of energy. And we used to describe him like a little a battery that wouldn't run out. No matter what happens, he will always get up again and run straight at the wall again. He's full of energy as well. But then once we got up into space, suddenly there was this sense of quiet, and there was this sense of the scale of the place. And all of a sudden, it's like the music opened up and things aren't as rapid anymore, and there are much longer lines going on. And everything became much more textural as well. It's a lot more pure orchestral when we're on the ground, and then when we're up in Lunaria, there's a lot more in the way of sound design within the music and things moving around. I wanted to create this sense that Lunaria was glistening and shimmering, and that everything was alive. We used to talk about fizzing textures, Glenn and I would kind of make these things by processing various Chinese instruments and playing with things, just to give these ever-shifting textures, because everything up there is all floating around. So I wanted that to feel like that, but in a way that I could still carry the tunes and keep it as a very melodic kind of score.
Right, and you just mentioned the Chinese instruments, but I guess you also need to try to avoid sounding cliched in terms of sounds and instrumentation, right?
That was the first conversation we had, really, was that. And there was quite a lot of Chinese instrumentation already in the songs. And so my instinct was like, God, I don't want to do any more of that, because that's going to start feeling a little bit like that classic, Western composer doing China, and it's traditional Hollywood orchestra, but we've got a couple of solo instruments. And I desperately didn't want to do that. And so I took a bit more of a textural approach, which I tend to anyway. But it meant recording instruments early and gutsons and erhus and things like that, but then not necessarily using them in that form. I would kind of stretch them and use those as textures and almost build instruments out of them. So I could play, chords of long extended gutson notes that would kind of have a quality of China in them without being that specific sound. But once I'd built the textures, it felt like they were starting to suggest harmonies to me. And so that would all influence the way I was writing. So I tried to make it so that the Chinese instruments were there, but as part of the tapestry of the sound rather than, that more cliched sort of feel.
As I understand, Stephen, you actually had to record the music in Vienna. Initially, UK sessions had been scheduled at Abbey Road, if I'm informed correctly, but due to the pandemic, you actually had to participate in a remote recording?
Yeah, which was absolutely terrifying. I mean, we'd always planned for the UK records, and everything was all set up for that. But as we kept getting closer to it, London wasn't open yet, and we got so close. And I think there were sessions that week at Abbey Road, the week that we would have been there, but we just couldn't quite get everyone to agree that it was safe. And obviously that's the key thing. But Vienna was operational at that point, and they got on top of their COVID situation. And you could get, a good-sized orchestra in there. You couldn't have brass and woodwind playing at the same time as strings, so we had to do everything separately. But yeah, it was terrifying, because I've always been in the room, and I've always had direct communication with my musicians, and I've gone in and spoken to people, and it's always been a very direct process. So I was really nervous about how we'd pull it off. But we started off with the Journey to Lunaria, because I thought, let's start off and get people into the spirit of the film. And as soon as you started playing some of the melodies, all of a sudden you are talking the same language, and it actually was quite a straightforward process. And we had a most tremendous conductor called Johannes Vogel, who does an awful lot of work with those Viennese musicians, and was great. And he made it, the communication between me and the musicians, very direct. And it really did feel, after a day or so, it really felt like you were there. It's just talking down a different sort of microphone to a different country, but they made it as seamless as possible. And I think we got some good performances over the course of the sessions.
And you started by recording Journey to Lunaria, and the motif, I think, in the second half of the cue is also reprised a little bit later on in the cue. I think it's called a bonding experience. The scene with the two rabbits.
Yeah, that's exactly, and it's sort of introduced early on in the film when we first Bungie, the little white rabbit, sort of it almost gets the siren song of the moon and goes running off, and Faith has to chase, and that really was kind of, it's my Lunaria theme. I always used to think of it, and it's sort of the magic theme, and those two rabbits are kind of they have this sort of magical connection. And so it comes back in that scene, and then at the very end it comes back when they return to the Earth. But there it's kind of, it had to combine, and I always wanted the Lunaria melody to combine with Fei-Fei's own melody, and I was never sure I could do it. But to me, they had to combine because the whole point of her journey was that experience affected both Lunaria and Fei-Fei. For Fei-Fei, it kind of means that she learns to accept this new situation in her life. And for the people of Lunaria, they also learn that they accept. It's all about this acceptance. So the two things had to combine and change each other in some way. And I was always nervous about them coming together, and I kind of left it till quite late in the day to combine those two melodies. But when I did do it, they just seemed to lock together nicely, like they'd always wanted to be there in the same place. So that melody was that was the original demo that I did with the guitar and the whistling a couple of years ago. So it's one of those, it seems to have just landed in the nice place. Never really changed.
Right. And Stephen, have you on your recent projects had an experience where the music which you heard in your head did not work out for you as you had hoped it would? Or has the process of mocking things up eliminated this issue for you completely?
It's kind of happened all sorts of different ways, really. I mean, a lot of the things I've always ended up being most pleased with have come almost away from the studio, and I've just been walking along, or I've woken up and you've just had, the start of something. And then I always hear the sound of a score in my head in a funny way. When I watch the film for the first time, something about the way that colors hit the screen seem to make a sound in my head. But melodically, things will come out of any sort of process. Sometimes it's just me sitting playing a guitar whilst watching something else on the TV, and some little part will emerge that the next day I'll take to the piano and start to develop it. Other times it will just be, a case of sitting at the piano for a few hours and seeing what comes out, But you can usually tell quite quickly the one that has got some future in it. There's usually just something there that keeps tweaking it. The one that when you leave the studio for the evening is still going around in your head for a few hours afterwards. Those ones tend to make themselves known. But I've kind of, the longer I do this, the more I'm just open to things happening at any point, and I just make sure that I keep recording anything that I think's got a bit of promise, because sometimes just flicking through some of those recordings that you'd forgotten you'd made is kind of interesting, what might be there and suddenly seem appropriate for a scene or something. It does seem to come in all sorts of different ways.
Stephen, what's actually next for you? Your website says you are working on Last Night in Soho,
and the score's recorded, and the dub is going on at the moment, and I'm really excited for people to see that, because that's another really different sort of film, and certainly way different from anything I've worked on. And it just feels like we've gone to a different place with the work I've done with Edgar. It's a few films that I've done with Edgar now, and every time he just gives different challenges and a different sort of sound. And it's been a lot of fun to work on this one. We got a little interrupted by COVID, and we're finishing it a little later than we were supposed to, but it's come together nicely, and really excited for people to see it. Some amazing performances in it, and some amazing ideas, and all of Edgar's stylistic things are at another level. I think it's really good.
Is it orchestral and also synthetic, or largely orchestral? Can you disclose that?
Yeah, there's bits of both in there. Yep, and again, with Edgar's films, there tend to be a lot of songs in there, and on this one, there's certainly a lot of songs again. But as we did in Baby Driver, there's moments when we've taken songs and done things with them, and there's real combinations of songs and score in there, which I think we've pushed some of those techniques further than we've ever done before. So it's there's a lot of music in that film, and yeah, it's coming together.
Stephen, is there anything else you would like to add or share with me and our audience about your career in general, or about the latest projects which you scored? Anything else that comes to mind?
No, only really to thank you for what you do as well. I think I know a lot of my peers and the people I respect appear on your show, and love the fact that you and your listeners take such an interest in what we do. So thank you for that, and hopefully we can keep giving you things to like going forward.
Oh, I'm sure of that. And Stephen, thank you so very much for taking so much time out of your schedule again. And it was a pleasure to talk to you again. And I had a great time, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back.